The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly through the corridors that had become his second home. Unlike other children his age who might be rushing to catch a school bus or grabbing breakfast on the run, George moved with a careful dignity that seemed almost unnatural for someone so young. His polished black shoes clicked softly against the stone as he made his way toward the breakfast room, where his tutors would soon arrive for another day of private lessons. Behind him, at a respectful distance, walked Sergeant Michael Thompson, a decorated military officer who had been assigned as George's personal protection detail 6 months earlier. Thompson was a man of few words, his weathered face telling stories of service in Afghanistan and Iraq. He had protected diplomats, ministers, and even other members of the royal family, but something about this assignment felt different. Perhaps it was the way the young prince sometimes looked back at him with curious eyes, or how George would pause in his steps as if wanting to say something before continuing on in silence. The palace staff moved around them like shadows, bowing their heads slightly as George passed. Mrs. Eleanor Davies, the head housekeeper who had worked at the palace for over 30 years, straightened the fresh flowers in the hallway vase. James Mitchell, one of the younger footmen, polished the brass door handles with extra care, knowing that even the smallest detail would be noticed by the senior staff. In the kitchen, Chef Williams was already preparing the prince's breakfast, carefully arranging fresh fruit and toast on the finest china, just as he had done every morning for the past year. George paused at the large window overlooking the palace gardens. Outside, he could see the groundskeeper, an elderly man named Thomas, slowly raking the gravel paths. Thomas had been working at the palace for nearly 4 decades, and his bent back told the story of countless hours spent maintaining the pristine grounds that visitors from around the world came to admire. The old man's movements were slower than they used to be, and George had noticed how Thomas sometimes had to stop and rest against his rake, breathing heavily in the cool morning air. As George watched, Thomas stumbled slightly, catching himself before he could fall. The young prince pressed his hand against the cool glass of the window, his breath fogging up the surface. Behind him, Sergeant Thompson noticed the prince had stopped and quietly positioned himself nearby, his trained eyes scanning the surroundings, even though they were safely within the palace walls. "Sergeant Thompson," George said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time in weeks that the prince had spoken directly to his guard outside of the formal greetings they exchanged each morning. Thompson stepped forward, maintaining the proper distance. "Yes, Your Royal Highness?" George continued to watch Thomas in the garden. The old groundskeeper was now attempting to move a heavy wheelbarrow filled with fallen autumn leaves, his frail arms shaking with the effort. "Do you see the man in the garden? The one with the wheelbarrow?" Thompson followed the prince's gaze and nodded. "Yes, sir." "That would be Thomas Richardson, the head groundskeeper." "He looks tired," George observed, his young voice carrying a note of concern that surprised the experienced guard. "How old do you think he is?" Thompson studied the figure in the garden. He had seen the groundskeeper many times during his patrols, but had never really paid attention to the man's condition. "I believe he's in his 70s, sir. He's been working here longer than most of the staff." George was quiet for a long moment, watching as Thomas finally managed to push the wheelbarrow a few feet before stopping again to catch his breath. The morning air was crisp with the promise of winter, and small puffs of vapor escaped from the old man's mouth as he rested. "Does he have family?" George asked, still not turning away from the window. The question caught Thompson off guard. In all his years of protection duty, he had rarely heard members of the royal family ask personal questions about the staff, especially not with the genuine concern he heard in the young prince's voice. "I'm not certain, Your Royal Highness. I could inquire if you wish." George finally turned from the window, his young face serious in a way that made him seem older than his 10 years. "Would you?" I would like to know. As they continued toward the breakfast room, George's mind remained focused on the old groundskeeper. He had grown up surrounded by luxury and privilege, but something about watching Thomas struggle alone in the garden had stirred something deep within him. It was a feeling he couldn't quite name, but it made his chest feel tight and his thoughts restless. The breakfast room was elegantly set when they arrived, with morning sunlight streaming through tall windows draped in rich burgundy velvet. George took his usual seat at the polished mahogany table, but his appetite seemed diminished. He picked at his scrambled eggs and barely touched the fresh strawberries that had been arranged so carefully on his plate. Mrs. Davies entered to check on the prince's meal, as she did every morning. She had watched George grow from a small child into the thoughtful young man he was becoming, and she could sense when something was troubling him. "Is everything to your liking this morning, Your Royal Highness?" she asked gently. George looked up from his mostly untouched breakfast. "Mrs. Davies, how long has Thomas worked in the gardens?" The head housekeeper was surprised by the question, but answered readily. "Thomas Richardson has been with us for 38 years, sir. He started when he was just 35 years old, shortly after he left the army." "He was a soldier?" George's interest was clearly piqued. "Yes, sir. He served in Northern Ireland during some difficult times. When he came to us, he said he wanted a peaceful life, taking care of growing things instead of—" She paused, realizing she might be sharing too much. "Instead of what?" George pressed gently. Mrs. Davies glanced toward Sergeant Thompson, who nodded slightly, indicating she should continue. "Instead of being around conflict, sir. He said the gardens gave him peace." George absorbed this information quietly. The idea that someone could find healing in the simple act of tending to plants and maintaining beauty resonated with something in his young heart. He thought about all the times he had walked past the gardens, taking their perfection for granted, never thinking about the man who worked so hard to create that beauty. After breakfast, George was scheduled for his morning lessons with Dr. Patricia Holbrook, his history tutor. Dr. Holbrook was a distinguished woman in her 50s who had been teaching members of the royal family for over 2 decades. She arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, carrying her leather briefcase filled with carefully prepared lesson plans. As they settled into the study room, with its walls lined with first-edition books and portraits of past monarchs, Dr. Holbrook noticed that the prince seemed distracted. Usually, George was an attentive student who asked thoughtful questions about the lessons. Today, however, he kept glancing toward the window that overlooked the gardens. "Today we're going to discuss the concept of noblesse oblige," Dr. Holbrook began, opening her notebook. "Can you tell me what those words mean, Your Royal Highness?" George turned his attention back to his tutor, though his mind was still partially occupied with thoughts of the old groundskeeper. "It's French, isn't it? Something about nobility and obligation?" "Excellent. Yes, it literally means nobility obliges. It's the idea that those who are privileged by birth or position have a moral obligation to act generously and responsibly toward those who are less fortunate." The words hit George with unexpected force. He had heard similar concepts before in his various lessons about royal duty and service, but today they carried a weight they had never held before. He thought about his comfortable bedroom, his private tutors, his meals served on fine china, and then he thought about Thomas struggling with the heavy wheelbarrow in the cold morning air. "Dr. Holbrook," George said slowly, "if someone has privilege, what kind of responsibilities does that create?" The tutor smiled, pleased that her student was engaging with the concept so thoughtfully. "Well, throughout history, the greatest leaders have been those who understood that their advantages came with duties. They used their positions not just for personal comfort, but to improve the lives of others." George was quiet for a moment, processing this idea. What if someone wanted to help, but they weren't sure how? Dr. Holbrook studied her young pupil's earnest face. In her years of teaching, she had learned to recognize when a lesson was moving beyond academic theory into personal reflection. "The best place to start," she said gently, "is often right where you are. Sometimes the most meaningful help comes from noticing the people around us who might need support, even in small ways." The lesson continued, but George's mind kept returning to the image of Thomas in the garden. When Dr. Holbrook left at the end of their session, George remained in the study room, staring out at the gardens where he could still see the elderly groundskeeper working slowly among the flower beds. That afternoon, during his free time, George made a decision that would surprise everyone around him. Instead of staying indoors with his books or video games as he usually did, he asked Sergeant Thompson if they could walk through the gardens. Thompson was pleased with the request. Fresh air and exercise were always good for his young charge, and it would give him an opportunity to patrol the grounds more thoroughly. They stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, and George immediately spotted Thomas near the rose garden, carefully pruning the bushes in preparation for winter. As they walked along the gravel path, George's steps gradually slowed until he came to a stop about 20 feet from where Thomas was working. The old groundskeeper hadn't noticed them yet, absorbed as he was in his careful work. George watched as Thomas struggled to reach a high branch, his aged joints clearly causing him discomfort. "Sergeant Thompson," George said quietly, "would it be proper for me to speak with him?" Thompson considered the question carefully. While it wasn't common for members of the royal family to engage in lengthy conversations with staff members, there was nothing in protocol that forbade a polite interaction. "If you wish to acknowledge his service, sir, I'm sure that would be appropriate," Thompson replied. George took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the rose garden. As his footsteps crunched on the gravel, Thomas looked up from his work, immediately recognizing the young prince. The old man's weathered face showed surprise, and he quickly removed his worn cap, holding it respectfully in his hands. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas said, bowing his head. His voice was rough from years of working outdoors, but it carried a warmth that reminded George of his grandfather. "Good afternoon," George replied, his young voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. "The gardens look beautiful. You do wonderful work." Thomas's eyes showed surprise at the compliment. In his nearly 4 decades of service, he had occasionally received praise from senior staff members, but never directly from a member of the royal family. "Thank you, sir. It's an honor to maintain these grounds." George looked around at the carefully tended beds, the perfectly trimmed hedges, and the roses that Thomas had been pruning with such care. Even in the autumn, with many flowers past their bloom, the gardens maintained an elegance and order that spoke to decades of devoted attention. "Have you always enjoyed working with plants?" George asked, genuinely curious. The question seemed to catch Thomas off guard. He glanced nervously at Sergeant Thompson, unsure if he should engage in conversation with the prince. "It's all right," George said, noticing the old man's hesitation. "I'm interested in learning about the gardens." Thomas relaxed slightly. "I grew up on a farm, sir. My father taught me about soil and seasons, about how plants need different kinds of care depending on the weather and the time of year." His eyes took on a distant look as he spoke. "When I came here after my military service, I found that working in the gardens brought me a kind of peace I hadn't felt in a long time." George listened intently, struck by the sincerity in the old man's voice. Here was someone who had found purpose and healing in the simple act of nurturing growing things, creating beauty that others could enjoy. "It must be hard work," George observed, noticing how Thomas's hands were gnarled and soil-stained from years of labor. Thomas smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face. "Good work isn't always easy work, sir, but when you see something beautiful growing because of your care, it makes the effort worthwhile." They talked for a few more minutes, with George asking questions about different plants, and Thomas explaining the cycles of garden maintenance throughout the year. As their conversation drew to a close, George noticed that Thomas had been standing the entire time, despite the obvious discomfort it caused him. "Thank you for taking the time to explain things to me," George said formally. "I hope you have a good rest of your day." As they walked away, George's mind was churning with thoughts. The conversation had revealed a depth and dignity in the old groundskeeper that made the prince see him not just as a worker maintaining the palace grounds, but as a person with his own story, his own struggles, and his own quiet wisdom. That evening, as George prepared for bed, he found himself thinking about the concept of noblesse oblige that Dr. Holbrook had taught him that morning. The idea that privilege created responsibility felt less abstract now, more personal and immediate. He thought about Thomas's weathered hands and the way the old man had struggled with the heavy wheelbarrow that morning. Sergeant Thompson conducted his evening security check, ensuring that the prince's quarters were secure for the night. As he prepared to take his position outside the room, George called to him. "Sergeant Thompson?" "Yes." "Your Royal Highness? You said you would inquire about Thomas's family. Were you able to learn anything?" Thompson nodded. "Yes, sir. Thomas is a widower. His wife passed away 3 years ago. They had no children. He lives alone in a small cottage about a mile from the palace." The information settled heavily in George's chest. He had been imagining that Thomas went home each evening to a warm house filled with family members who appreciated his hard work. The reality that the old man returned each night to an empty home, tired and alone after his long days of physical labor, struck the young prince with unexpected force. As George lay in his comfortable bed that night, surrounded by warmth and luxury, he couldn't stop thinking about Thomas in his small cottage, probably sitting alone with his aching joints and memories of his deceased wife. The contrast between their lives felt stark and troubling. It was during those quiet moments before sleep that George began to form an idea that would soon surprise everyone at the palace and set in motion events that no one could have predicted. The next morning brought with it an unusual energy in Prince George's movements. Instead of his typical measured pace through the palace corridors, there was a sense of purpose in his step that Sergeant Thompson immediately noticed. The young prince had risen earlier than usual and was dressed and ready for the day before his normal wake-up time. After breakfast, George surprised his tutors by requesting to speak with Mrs. Davies privately. The head housekeeper found this unusual, as the prince typically communicated any special requests through his personal secretary, but she agreed to meet with him in the small sitting room adjacent to his study. "Mrs. Davies," George began, his young voice carrying a seriousness that reminded her of his father. "I would like to know more about the staff who work here at the palace. Specifically, I'm wondering about their living situations and whether they have everything they need." The request caught Mrs. Davies completely off guard. In her 30 years of service, she had never received such an inquiry from a member of the royal family, especially not from someone so young. "Your Royal Highness, that's very thoughtful of you to ask. The staff are generally well provided for. We have our quarters here at the palace, and those who live off the grounds receive housing allowances." George nodded but pressed further. "What about Thomas Richardson, the groundskeeper? Sergeant Thompson told me he lives alone in a cottage nearby." Mrs. Davies studied the prince's face, trying to understand the motivation behind these questions. She had always been impressed by George's intelligence and maturity, but this level of concern for staff welfare was unexpected. "Thomas does live modestly, sir. His cottage is adequate, though I believe it can be quite cold in the winter months. He's never complained, mind you. Thomas isn't the type to ask for help, even when he might need it." This information seemed to trouble George. He was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking carefully about what he wanted to say next. "Mrs. Davies, if someone wanted to do something kind for Thomas, what do you think would be most helpful?" The head housekeeper realized that this conversation was heading in a direction she hadn't expected. The young prince wasn't simply asking questions out of curiosity. He was genuinely considering taking some kind of action. "Well, sir, Thomas has been struggling with his heating bills. The cottage is old, and it's expensive to keep warm. He's also been having some difficulty with the heavier aspects of his work, though he's too proud to admit it." George absorbed this information with the gravity of someone much older. The image of Thomas returning to a cold cottage each evening, probably trying to save money on heating while dealing with the aches and pains of physical labor, created a knot of concern in the young prince's stomach. "Would it be possible," George asked carefully, "for me to visit Thomas's cottage? I mean, would that be allowed?" Mrs. Davies was genuinely taken aback by the request. Royal family members simply didn't make personal visits to staff homes. The protocols, the security concerns, the precedent it would set, all of these factors made such a visit extremely complicated. "Your Royal Highness, I'm not sure that is, there would be many arrangements that would need to be made." George could see the hesitation in Mrs. Davies's expression, but rather than being discouraged, he seemed to become more determined. What if it wasn't an official visit? What if it was just a person checking on another person? The simple way George phrased this struck Mrs. Davies deeply. Here was a 10-year-old boy who was beginning to understand that beneath all the titles and protocols, fundamental human kindness was what truly mattered. Later that morning, during his mathematics lesson with Professor Williams, George found it difficult to concentrate on algebraic equations. His mind kept wandering to thoughts of Thomas and the cottage that was too expensive to heat properly. When Professor Williams noticed his distraction and gently asked if something was troubling him, George made a decision that would surprise everyone. "Professor Williams, do you think it's possible for someone my age to make a real difference in another person's life?" The mathematics professor, a scholarly man who had been teaching for over 20 years, set down his calculator and gave George his full attention. It wasn't unusual for students to ask philosophical questions, but there was something in the prince's tone that suggested this wasn't academic curiosity. "I believe that age is less important than intention and action, Your Royal Highness. Some of history's most significant acts of kindness have come from young people who simply saw a need and decided to address it." George nodded, seeming to find encouragement in this response. "What if someone wanted to help, but the normal rules might make it complicated?" Professor Williams studied his young student carefully. "Sometimes the most meaningful help comes not from following rules, but from following your conscience. Of course, that doesn't mean ignoring all guidance, but rather finding a way to do what's right within appropriate boundaries." After his lessons ended that day, George made a request that sent ripples of concern throughout the palace staff. He asked to speak with his personal secretary, Miss Hartwell, about arranging a visit to Thomas Richardson's cottage. Miss Hartwell was a efficient woman in her 40s who had been managing royal schedules and protocols for over a decade, and George's request left her speechless. "Your Royal Highness, such a visit would require security clearance, advanced preparation, official protocols. It's simply not something that can be arranged casually." But George had anticipated this response. He had spent the entire day thinking about the obstacles that would be placed in his way, and he had developed what he thought might be a solution. "What if Sergeant Thompson and I were simply taking a walk through the neighborhood, and we happened to stop by Thomas's cottage, not as an official visit, but just as neighbors?" The word neighbors, coming from the lips of a member of the royal family, was so unexpected that Miss Hartwell needed a moment to process it. She realized that the young prince was not going to be easily dissuaded from this course of action. "Sir, I would need to discuss this with senior staff and security. There are many considerations." "I understand," George said patiently. "But while you're discussing it, Thomas is going home to a cold cottage every night. Sometimes the right thing to do is more important than the convenient thing to do." The maturity and conviction in George's voice left Miss Hartwell with little choice but to agree to explore the possibility, though she privately doubted that such an unconventional visit would be approved. That evening, as Sergeant Thompson conducted his regular security briefing, he was surprised to receive a message requesting his presence at an impromptu meeting with senior palace staff. When he arrived at the conference room, he found Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Davies, and Chief of Security Colonel Harrison waiting for him. "Sergeant Thompson," Colonel Harrison began, "we understand that Prince George has expressed interest in visiting one of the groundskeeper's homes. We need to understand how this situation developed and what your assessment is." Thompson recounted the conversations he had witnessed between George and various staff members, describing the prince's growing interest in Thomas's welfare. As he spoke, he realized that what he was describing was a young person's natural compassion being awakened by real contact with someone in need. "In my assessment, sir," Thompson concluded, "His Royal Highness is not acting on a whim. He has given serious thought to this matter, and his concerns appear to be genuine." Colonel Harrison frowned. Regardless of his sincerity, the security implications of such a visit are significant. We would need to sweep the cottage, establish secure perimeters, brief local law enforcement. "With respect, sir," Thompson interrupted, which surprised everyone in the room. "What if we approached this differently? What if this wasn't treated as an official royal visit, but simply as a young person being accompanied by his protection officer on a neighborhood walk?" Mrs. Davies leaned forward. "Thomas would be absolutely overwhelmed if we descended on his cottage with full security protocols. The poor man would probably be terrified." Miss Hartwell sighed. "The precedent this would set is concerning. If we allow this, what other unconventional requests might follow?" "Perhaps," Mrs. Davies suggested gently, "the precedent we should be concerned about setting is teaching a young member of the royal family that caring about others is less important than following protocol." The room fell silent as everyone considered this perspective. They were dealing with a situation that had no clear precedent, where a young prince was asking to act on his natural compassion in a way that challenged traditional boundaries. Colonel Harrison finally spoke. "If we were to consider this, it would need to be done in the simplest way possible. Minimal security presence, no advance notice to the media, and absolutely no official documentation." Thompson nodded. "That's exactly what the prince has requested, sir. He doesn't want to create a spectacle. He just wants to check on an elderly man who has served the palace faithfully for decades." The meeting continued for another hour, with each participant weighing the risks against the potential benefits. Gradually, they began to develop a plan that would allow George's visit while maintaining appropriate security and discretion. The following morning, George was informed that his request had been approved, with certain conditions. The visit would take place during regular walking hours, with only Sergeant Thompson as escort. There would be no advance notice given to Thomas, and the visit would be brief and informal. George's excitement was carefully controlled, but Mrs. Davies could see the satisfaction in his eyes. The young prince had faced the full weight of palace protocol and bureaucracy, and his determination to do something kind for another person had prevailed. As they prepared for the visit that afternoon, Sergeant Thompson found himself reflecting on his years of protection duty. He had guarded politicians, diplomats, and other royals, but he had never encountered someone who was willing to challenge the system simply to perform an act of kindness. The walk to Thomas's cottage took about 20 minutes, leading them through tree-lined streets where autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet. George was uncharacteristically quiet during the walk, and Thompson could sense that the prince was both nervous and excited about what they were about to do. Thomas's cottage was a small, neat building with a garden that showed the same careful attention he gave to the palace grounds. Even in late autumn, the small front yard was tidy and well-maintained, though Thompson's trained eye noticed that some maintenance tasks around the house had been deferred, probably due to Thomas's age or financial constraints. When they knocked on the front door, the sound of Thomas's approaching footsteps was slow and careful. When the door opened and Thomas saw Prince George standing on his doorstep, the old man's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then something approaching panic. "Your Royal Highness!" Thomas exclaimed, immediately attempting to bow while still holding the door handle for support. "Please, Thomas," George said gently. "There's no need for that. We were taking a walk in the neighborhood, and I hoped we might visit with you for a few minutes." Thomas looked past George to Sergeant Thompson, as if seeking confirmation that this was really happening. Thompson nodded reassuringly, and Thomas stepped back to invite them into his humble home. The cottage was small, but spotlessly clean, with furniture that was obviously old but well-maintained. George immediately noticed how cold the air was inside the house, and he could see Thomas's breath as the old man nervously offered them tea. "Please don't go to any trouble," George said, but Thomas was already bustling toward the small kitchen, clearly flustered by this unprecedented visit. As they sat in Thomas's tiny living room drinking tea from mismatched cups, George looked around at the simple surroundings. There were photographs on the mantelpiece showing a younger Thomas with a woman who was obviously his late wife, and a few framed certificates recognizing his military service and his years of work at the palace. The conversation was initially awkward, with Thomas clearly unsure of how to behave in this situation. But gradually, as George asked gentle questions about his garden and his years of service, the old man began to relax. "I hope you're staying warm enough now that the weather is getting colder," George said, noticing that Thomas was wearing multiple layers of clothing even inside the house. Thomas hesitated, clearly reluctant to admit any difficulties. "Oh, yes, sir. I'm quite comfortable." But George had already noticed the small space heater in the corner that was obviously being used to warm just the one room, and he could see that Thomas's breath was still visible in the chilly air. "Thomas," George said gently, "is there anything you need? Anything that would make your home more comfortable?" The direct question seemed to overwhelm Thomas. His eyes filled with tears, and for a moment he couldn't speak. When he finally found his voice, it was barely above a whisper. "Your Royal Highness, in all my years of service, no one has ever asked me that question. No one has ever cared enough to visit my home or wonder if I needed anything." The raw emotion in Thomas's voice hit George like a physical force. Here was a man who had given nearly 4 decades of faithful service, who had created beauty for others to enjoy, and who had been essentially invisible to everyone around him. George looked around the cold cottage, at the proud but struggling old man who had served his family for so many years, and made a decision that would change everything. "Thomas," he said quietly, "that's going to change, starting today." The journey back to the palace after visiting Thomas's cottage was filled with a contemplative silence that Sergeant Thompson had rarely experienced during his protection duties. Prince George walked slowly, his young mind clearly processing everything he had seen and felt during their visit to the groundskeeper's humble home. The stark contrast between the cold, sparsely furnished cottage and the warm, luxurious palace rooms he was accustomed to had left a profound impression on the 10-year-old prince. As they approached the palace gates, George finally spoke, his voice carrying a determination that surprised even the experienced military officer walking beside him. "Sergeant Thompson, when we return, I need to speak with Mrs. Davies immediately, and I'd like to meet with whoever handles the palace's financial arrangements for staff." Thompson glanced at his young charge, recognizing the tone of someone who had made up his mind about something important. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. May I ask what you're planning?" George paused in his steps, looking back in the direction of Thomas's cottage, though it was no longer visible through the trees. "I'm planning to do what should have been done years ago," he replied simply. Within an hour of their return, George had assembled what could only be described as an impromptu meeting in the palace's small conference room. Mrs. Davies sat across from him, along with Mr. Charles Wickham, the palace's administrative manager who handled staff affairs, and Miss Hartwell, who was taking notes with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "I want to arrange for Thomas Richardson's cottage to be properly heated this winter," George announced without preamble. "I also want to ensure that he has adequate food and any medical care he might need." Mr. Wickham, a meticulous man who had managed palace finances for 15 years, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Your Royal Highness, while your concern is admirable, we have established protocols for staff assistance. If Mr. Richardson is experiencing financial hardship, he could apply for emergency funds through the proper channels." "How long would that take?" George interrupted, a question that caught everyone off guard. "Well, there would need to be an application, a review process, verification of need," Wickham began. "How long?" George repeated firmly. "Perhaps 6 to 8 weeks, assuming all documentation is properly submitted." George absorbed this information with obvious displeasure. So Thomas would continue living in a freezing cottage for 2 more months while paperwork is processed? The directness of George's assessment made everyone in the room uncomfortable. They were being forced to confront the gap between bureaucratic efficiency and human need, seen through the eyes of a child who couldn't understand why helping someone should be complicated. "Your Royal Highness," Miss Hartwell said gently, "there are proper procedures for these matters. We can't simply bypass established protocols." "Why not?" George asked, his question so simple and direct that it left the adults momentarily speechless. Mrs. Davies, who had remained quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up. "Perhaps we could explore options that work within our existing framework, but with expedited timing." George turned to her gratefully. "What would that look like?" "We could arrange for immediate heating repairs and fuel delivery as an emergency maintenance issue," Mrs. Davies suggested. "And we could ensure that Thomas receives meal allowances that reflect the full amount he's entitled to." Mr. Wickham looked uncomfortable with this approach. "That would require authorization from senior management, and frankly, it might set a precedent that could be difficult to manage going forward." The word precedent seemed to particularly irritate George. He had heard it used repeatedly as a reason why helpful actions couldn't be taken, and his patience with such reasoning was wearing thin. "Mr. Wickham," George said, his young voice taking on a formality that reminded everyone in the room of his royal heritage. "I want you to consider something. Thomas Richardson has worked for my family for 38 years. He has maintained our gardens through every season in all kinds of weather, creating beauty that thousands of visitors have enjoyed. He has never complained, never asked for special treatment, and never failed in his duties." George paused, letting this sink in before continuing. "Now he's elderly, he's alone, and he's struggling to heat his home. If we can't find a way to help him quickly and without bureaucratic obstacles, then what exactly is the point of our position and our resources?" The room fell into complete silence. The adults present were grappling with a perspective they had never considered. Here was a 10-year-old boy articulating a philosophy of leadership and responsibility that put their administrative concerns into sharp perspective. Miss Hartwell was the first to speak. "Your Royal Highness, I believe we can find ways to expedite the necessary approvals. Perhaps we could frame this as recognition for Thomas's long service rather than as financial assistance." George nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what it should be. This isn't charity. This is honoring someone who has served faithfully for nearly 4 decades. Over the following days, George threw himself into ensuring that his plans for helping Thomas were implemented quickly and thoroughly. He personally reviewed the arrangements for heating system repairs, approved the selection of a local heating oil supplier who would provide regular deliveries, and insisted on visiting Thomas again to explain what was being arranged. The second visit to Thomas's cottage took place on a cold Thursday afternoon, with autumn rain pattering against the windows of the small house. This time, Thomas was expecting them, though he still seemed overwhelmed by the continued attention from the young prince. When George explained the heating arrangements and other support that would be provided, Thomas's reaction was more emotional than anyone had anticipated. The elderly groundskeeper broke down completely, tears streaming down his weathered face as he struggled to find words. "Your Royal Highness, I don't know how to thank you. In all my years, no one has ever... I never expected..." Thomas's voice broke, and he had to stop speaking altogether. George, showing a maturity beyond his years, simply sat quietly with the crying man, waiting for him to regain his composure. When Thomas finally looked up, the prince spoke gently. "Thomas, you've spent your entire career making life more beautiful for everyone around you. It's time someone made life a little easier for you." The simplicity and sincerity of this statement seemed to comfort Thomas more than any formal expression of gratitude could have. As word of George's actions spread through the palace staff, it created an unusual atmosphere. Some staff members were moved by the young prince's compassion and felt proud to serve a family that would produce such a caring individual. Others were concerned about the implications of these unprecedented actions and worried about how they might be perceived by senior royal family members. It was Mrs. Davies who first noticed the change in Thomas when he returned to work the following Monday. The elderly groundskeeper moved with more energy than she had seen in months, and there was a lightness in his step that seemed to have been absent for years. "He looks like a different person," she remarked to Sergeant Thompson as they watched Thomas working in the rose garden with obvious satisfaction. Thompson nodded. "It's not just the practical help, though that's certainly important. It's the knowledge that someone noticed him, that someone cared enough to take action." What none of them anticipated was how profoundly the experience would affect Prince George himself. His tutors began to notice that their lessons took on new depth when they touched on topics related to leadership, responsibility, and social justice. George's questions became more probing, his interest more personal. During a history lesson about past monarchs, George asked Dr. Holbrook, "Which rulers do you think made the biggest difference in individual people's lives?" Dr. Holbrook considered this thoughtfully. "Often it wasn't the ones who won the greatest battles or built the most monuments. It was the ones who paid attention to the daily struggles of ordinary people and used their power to address those struggles." George absorbed this lesson with obvious interest, and Dr. Holbrook could see that their academic discussions were connecting with something real in the prince's experience. The transformation in both George and Thomas became the subject of quiet conversation throughout the palace. Senior staff members who had initially been concerned about protocol found themselves moved by the results of George's intervention. Thomas's renewed energy and obvious gratitude created a positive atmosphere that affected everyone who worked with him. More importantly, other staff members began to take notice of their colleagues who might be struggling. The precedent that George had worried officials about setting turned out to be a positive one. Mrs. Davies received several quiet inquiries from staff members asking how they might help co-workers who were facing difficulties. However, the most significant moment was yet to come. It occurred on a gray November morning, exactly 3 weeks after George's first visit to Thomas's cottage. George was walking through the gardens with Sergeant Thompson, as had become their daily routine since the visit to Thomas. They paused near the rose garden where Thomas was working, now wearing a new winter coat that Mrs. Davies had arranged for him as part of the recognition package for his long service. As George watched Thomas working with obvious comfort and renewed vigor, he felt a sense of satisfaction that was entirely new to him. This wasn't the satisfaction of receiving a gift or accomplishing something academic. This was the deeper satisfaction of knowing that his actions had genuinely improved another person's life. "Your Royal Highness," came a voice behind them. George turned to see Thomas approaching, moving more easily than he had in years. The groundskeeper was holding something in his hands, and his expression was serious, but warm. "I wanted to give you something," Thomas said, extending his hands to reveal a small wooden box that he had obviously crafted himself. George accepted the box carefully, noting the smooth wood and careful craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. "I made it from wood from the old oak tree that we had to remove from the east garden last spring," Thomas explained. "I thought you might like to have something that came from the palace grounds, something that grew here." George opened the box to find that Thomas had lined it with velvet and carved his initials into the lid with remarkable skill. "Thomas, this is beautiful. But you didn't need to make me anything." The old groundskeeper smiled, and George could see a peace in his eyes that hadn't been there during their first garden conversation. "Your Royal Highness, you gave me back my dignity. You reminded me that my work matters, that I matter. That's worth more than heating bills or winter coats." The simple honesty of Thomas's words struck George deeply. He realized that what he had thought of as practical help had meant something much more profound to the elderly man. "Thomas," George said quietly, "your work has always mattered. I'm sorry it took so long for someone to tell you that." As they parted that morning, George carrying the wooden box that represented so much more than its simple appearance suggested, Sergeant Thompson observed something he had never seen before in his years of protection duty. Walking back toward the palace, George's steps slowed and eventually stopped altogether. The prince stood quietly on the gravel path holding Thomas's gift, and Thompson could see that the young man was deeply moved. "Sergeant Thompson," George said without turning around, "promise me something." "Of course, Your Royal Highness." "Promise me that we'll never become so concerned with protocol and procedures that we forget to notice when people around us need help." Thompson looked at the 10-year-old prince who had just articulated one of the most important lessons of leadership he had ever heard. "I promise, sir. And if I may say so, Your Royal Highness, I think that's a promise you'll never need to worry about breaking." As they continued their walk back to the palace, the silence that followed was different from the contemplative quiet that had marked their return from Thomas's cottage 3 weeks earlier. This silence was filled with a sense of completion, of a lesson learned, and a responsibility embraced. George carried Thomas's wooden box carefully, understanding that it represented something much larger than a simple gift. It was a symbol of the connection that could exist between people when artificial barriers were set aside in favor of genuine human caring. That afternoon, during his regular lessons, George's tutors noticed a change in him that went beyond increased confidence or maturity. There was a sense of purpose in his approach to learning, as if he now understood that his education was not just about preparing for future responsibilities, but about developing the wisdom and compassion necessary to use power in service of others. Dr. Holbrook, in particular, observed that George's questions about historical leaders had evolved from academic curiosity to genuine interest in understanding how to make a positive difference in people's lives. When word of George's actions eventually reached the senior members of the royal family, their response surprised many of the palace staff who had been worried about potential criticism. Instead of concerns about protocol, there was recognition that the young prince had demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and compassion that the monarchy needed to embody. The story of Prince George and Thomas the groundskeeper became one of those quiet palace legends that staff members would share with new employees as an example of what service truly meant. It wasn't just about following procedures or maintaining traditions, but about remembering that behind every role and title was a human being deserving of dignity and care. And in the palace gardens, as autumn turned to winter and then to spring, Thomas Richardson continued his work with a renewed sense of purpose and joy. Visitors to the palace often commented on the exceptional beauty of the grounds, never knowing that the gardens were tended by an elderly man whose life had been transformed by a 10-year-old prince who had simply noticed that someone needed help and had refused to let protocol prevent him from providing it. The wooden box that Thomas had crafted sat on George's bedside table, a daily reminder of the most important lesson he had learned, that true nobility comes not from titles or ceremonies, but from the willingness to see the humanity in others and to act with kindness when action is needed. Years later, when historians would write about this period in the young prince's development, many would point to this experience as the moment when George truly began to understand what it meant to serve others. But for those who witnessed it firsthand, it was simply the story of a young person who saw someone in need and decided that helping was more important than following rules. The silence that had filled the palace when George first showed kindness to Thomas had been the silence of surprise, of a system adjusting to an unexpected act of compassion. But the silence that followed was different entirely. It was the profound quiet of respect, of recognition that something important had taken place, and of understanding that true leadership begins with the simple decision to care about the people around us. And in that silence, Thomas Richardson, groundskeeper and guardian of the palace gardens, continued his work with the knowledge that his decades of faithful service had finally been seen, acknowledged, and honored by someone who understood that every person's contribution matters, regardless of their position or status. The guard had not walked off in anger or frustration, but in honor of what he had witnessed, a young prince learning the most important lesson of leadership, and an elderly servant receiving the recognition he had earned through a lifetime of quiet, devoted service.